Montana Territory, May 1874. The rain had not stopped in 3 days when she showed up, soaked through and leading 2 shivering children behind her, boots sinking into the mud outside the livery barn. Elijah Zane stood in the doorway, hat tipped low, coat dripping, watching the girl approach like she had nowhere else left in the world. She looked about 24, maybe a year or two younger than him. Her dress was torn at the hem. Her face was streaked with water and road dust. But her back was straight and her grip on the children's hands was steady. "You the owner here?" she asked, voice hoarse. "I am," Elijah said. "Name's Elijah Zane. This is my place." The boy beside her looked to be about 8, the girl maybe 5. Both had the same dark hair. The boy's eyes darted to Elijah's rifle leaning by the door, but the girl just stared up at him like she was trying to figure out if he was safe. "I'm Susanna Finch," the woman said. "These are my brother's kids. He passed last winter. Their mother left years ago. I've been trying to get them to Helena, but the wagon broke an axle outside of town. We walked the last 3 miles. Elijah nodded slow. "You got folks in Helena?" "No," she said, "but I heard of work, and I thought maybe I could find something there." "For the kids." The boy's lip trembled, but he pressed it firm. Elijah stepped aside. "Get in out of the rain. I got coffee on. Stove's hot." Susanna hesitated for just a second, then nodded. "Thank you." Inside the barn's side room, Elijah had a wood stove and a rough pine table. He handed her a towel and a blanket for each child. The girl clung to Susanna's skirts until Elijah crouched down and offered her a tin cup of warm milk. She took it with both hands. "They yours?" he asked low. "No," Susanna said, rubbing the boy's shoulders. "But they are mine now." Elijah looked at her for a long second. She did not flinch, just met his eyes. "I got a spare room upstairs," he said. "Ain't much, but it's dry. You can stay until the weather clears." "I do not have money," Susanna said quickly, "but I will work. I can sew, clean, cook." "I did not ask for payment," Elijah said. She looked down at the children, then back up at him. Her mouth trembled a little at the corners, not fear, but something like guilt or pride. She nodded. "All right," she said. That night, after the children were asleep, Susanna sat at the table with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee Elijah had poured for her. The rain tapped constant against the roof. "I do not know what I am doing," she admitted softly. "I was a school teacher before, in Illinois. I came west to help my brother when he got sick. Then he died. Then everything else fell apart." Elijah drank from his own mug. "You are holding it together fine from where I am sitting." She gave a tired laugh. "You always this quiet?" "Mostly." She watched him a moment, then asked, "What do you want in a wife?" Elijah looked over at her. The firelight flickered against her face. Her cheeks were pink from the heat. Her eyes were still tired but steady. He set his mug down slow. "Just someone who will stay when it rains." Susanna blinked. Then her lips curved just a little. "Might be I can do that," she murmured. Elijah stood, went to the stove, tossed another log on. The room warmed more. "You ever run a ranch kitchen?" he asked. "No, but I am a quick learner. Tomorrow morning I will show you how things work around here. You and the kids can stay as long as you need." She looked up at him again. "Why are you being kind to me?" Elijah met her eyes. "Because you did not leave those kids behind." The next day dawned gray, but the rain had calmed to a mist. Susanna rolled up her sleeves and scrubbed the floors without asking. She cooked breakfast with what she could find in the larder. It was plain but good. Elijah showed the boy Eben how to sweep the barn and feed the mule. The girl Elsie followed Susanna everywhere, her small hand never far from her skirt. Elijah watched them from the fence line that afternoon. Susanna was helping Elsie gather kindling, her voice soft, patient. When she stood, brushing her hands on her apron, she looked over at Elijah and smiled. It was not a big smile, but it was real. That night, Elijah sat on the porch, oil lamp flickering beside him, boots up on the rail. Susanna came out and leaned against the post, arms crossed. "You always this quiet?" she asked again. He looked over at her. "Only when I am thinking." "What about?" He hesitated. "How long you plan to stay?" Susanna's eyes searched his face. "I do not know yet, but I am not going anywhere tonight." The wind picked up, rustling the trees. The sky grumbled low. "Storm's coming again," Elijah said. "I know." She stepped closer to him. "I will stay," she said, "if you want me to." Elijah stood, stepped down from the porch, walked to her slow. He stopped in front of her, eyes searching her face. "I do," he said. "I want you to." She looked up at him, and something shifted in her eyes, something soft and sure. "Then I will stay," she whispered. The first drop of rain hit the porch rail. She did not flinch, did not move. Elijah reached for her hand. She let him. They stood there in the slow rain, hands clasped, and for the first time in a long while, neither one of them felt alone. The wind had shifted by morning, the kind that rolled down from the mountains and carried the scent of pine and wet earth. Susanna stood at the pump behind the barn, sleeves rolled above her elbows, drawing water while Elsie poked small sticks into the soft ground nearby. Eben was helping Elijah mend a loose board on the paddock fence, holding the nails steady without being told. "You ever work with a horse?" Elijah asked as he straightened. Eben nodded. "Uncle had a mare. I fed her oats, brushed her when he was too sick to get up." "You afraid of him?" "No, sir." Elijah handed him the hammer. "Then you're ahead of most." The boy's eyes lit up in a way Elijah hadn't seen before. He didn't speak again, just set to work, tongue pressed to one corner of his mouth in concentration. Later, Susanna brought out bread wrapped in cloth and a jar of pickled beans from the cellar. She spread everything out on the barn table and they ate without rush. Elijah watched the way Susanna cut Eben's slice thinner than her own, how she refilled Elsie's cup before taking a sip herself. She didn't notice him noticing. She just did it. "Do you mind if I wash some of the linens?" she asked, setting her mug down. "I saw a line strung up behind the smokehouse." "There's ash soap in the cabinet beside the stove," Elijah said. "Water's cold this time of year, you sure?" "I've had worse," she said. "Besides, I can't sit still too long." By mid-afternoon, white sheets danced on the line behind the house. Susanna's hands were raw, but she didn't complain. She sang softly while she worked, not loud enough to make out the words, just a hum that rose and fell like a lullaby. Elsie curled up on the porch with a doll fashioned from a corn husk, and Eben leaned against the doorway, watching the hills. Elijah stood near the corral, adjusting a saddle cinch, but his eyes kept drifting back to the house. When the sun dipped low and the wind settled, Elijah brought out a clay jug and 2 tin cups. He poured whiskey into one and handed it to Susanna as she sat on the porch steps, her skirt hem damp from the grass. The other he kept for himself. "You ever think about going back?" he asked. She turned the cup in her hands. "Back to Illinois," he nodded. "No," she said. "There's nothing left. My parents passed when I was young. My brother was all I had. After he died, there wasn't a reason to stay put." Elijah took a slow sip. "You miss teaching?" "Sometimes," she said. "But I don't miss the school board telling me how to speak or what books the children can't read. Out here, everything's harder, but it's honest." A quiet stretched between them, not uncomfortable, just full of unspoken things. "You always mean to live alone?" she asked. "I didn't plan one way or the other, just kept working. Days add up." "You ever come close?" He shook his head. "Not really. Folks pass through. I never asked anyone to stay." She looked at him then, really looked. "Why not?" "I figured they wouldn't," he said. She watched the sky for a long moment before saying, "You might be wrong about that." Eben came out, rubbing his eye. "Elsie's asleep," he said. "Should I carry her in? I'll do it," Elijah said quietly. He stood and walked inside. When he returned, she was still sitting there, cup resting on the step beside her, fingers laced in her lap. "I've got a cousin in Bozeman," Elijah said. "He runs a store with his wife. She's always asking if I know someone who can sew or take up mending. You think they'd hire me? If I send word, I think they'd be glad to." She nodded, then said, "I'd like to stay here a little longer, until the children are steadier. And I'd rather earn my keep while I do." He leaned against the post beside her. "You already are." She didn't answer, but her shoulders eased. The wind had gone still, the air heavy with the promise of frost. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out, but it faded before it reached them. "You ever think about what comes next?" she asked. "I think about tomorrow," he said. "That's usually enough." She looked over, her voice low. "Would you mind if I started thinking about it for both of us?" Elijah turned to her. He didn't smile, didn't speak right away. Just reached down, took her hand in his, and held it with a quiet steadiness that said more than any vow. She let him. By late June, the ground had dried and the cottonwoods along the creek wore their full green. The days came long and warm, and the nights, though still cool, no longer carried the bite of spring frost. Susanna had taken to waking early, before the sun cleared the ridge, to set bread to rise and sweep the porch while the children still slept. Once the first light broke, Elijah would be outside, already saddled and riding fence or tending the lower pasture. He never said where he'd be, but by now she could read his tracks. One afternoon, as Susanna stitched a tear in Eben's shirt by the barn window, Elijah rode back in with a side of venison tied behind his saddle. He dismounted without hurry, wiped his brow with the edge of his sleeve, and led the horse to water. "That'll last us through the week," she said, nodding to the meat. "More if we smoke it right," he replied. "You ever done that?" "Once, with my brother. We ruined most of it," she said, threading her needle again. "But I remember the smell. Then I'll show you." Fire pits set up behind the shed. The next morning they began early, stringing the strips along poles and keeping the fire low and steady. Susanna watched the smoke curl and settle, her hands moving without pause. Elijah worked beside her, sleeves rolled, knife at his side. Elsie played with a stick in the dirt nearby, drawing quiet circles. Eben was off with the mule, hauling water back from the spring. Susanna glanced up as Elijah tossed more hickory on the coals. "Were you close to your folks?" she asked. He hesitated, squinting toward the hills. "My ma passed when I was a boy. My pa and I worked cattle together till I turned 18. He died not long after." She nodded, pulling a strip taut. "You ever think about leaving Montana?" Elijah shook his head. "This land's hard, but it's honest. I can breathe here." She didn't respond right away. The smoke shifted with the wind, carrying the scent of meat and wood through the yard. "I used to think I wanted a life with lace curtains and Sunday teas," she said after a moment. "But I don't miss any of it. I'd rather have sore hands and a roof that doesn't leak." Elijah looked at her then, his gaze steady. "You've got both now." That night after supper they sat on the back stoop, watching dusk settle over the hills. Fireflies blinked in the tall grass, and the faint bleat of sheep echoed from a neighbor's field down the valley. Elsie had fallen asleep with her cheek against Susanna's knee, and Eben sat cross-legged nearby, tying knots into a length of cord. Elijah leaned an elbow on the railing. "I've been thinking about the cabin out near the cedar grove," he said. "It's old, but the frame's sound. Needs a new roof and fresh mortar on the chimney." Susanna looked over, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. "You want to fix it up?" "I want to live in it," he said. "With you?" "With the children." She was quiet for a long while. Eben had glanced up but said nothing. The wind rustled low through the pines behind the barn. "You mean that?" she asked. "I wouldn't say it if I didn't." She ran her palm gently along Elsie's back. "I don't have much to give you. You gave me your trust, you gave me peace. That's more than most ever do." The sky darkened to indigo. A single star pulsed above the ridge. "You'll need a strong roof before the snow comes," she said softly. "I'll start on it tomorrow." She reached out and took his hand, warm and calloused from the day's work. "Then let's build it together." Elijah's fingers closed around hers, sure and steady. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The cabin stood quiet beneath the cedar grove, its walls silvered from years of wind and snow, but the foundation held firm. Elijah had cleared the moss from the eaves and stripped the warped shingles by hand. Susanna worked beside him with a steady rhythm, her hair pinned back beneath a kerchief, her arms streaked with dust. Eben ferried bundles of cut wood, and Elsie helped pack clay between the stones at the base of the chimney, her small hands careful and sure. By midsummer, the rafters were raised and the new roof slanted clean against the sky. Elijah carved the door latch himself from a piece of hickory, smoothing it with a rasp until it fit snug in her palm. "That's yours to open," he told Susanna one evening as they stood beside the hearth, the smell of fresh hewn pine still thick in the air. She turned the latch slowly, as if marking the moment. The children moved in first. Eben laid out his bedding beneath the front window and placed his few belongings, a worn book, a jackknife, a folded drawing along the sill. Elsie tucked her rag doll beside the pillow without a word. Susanna brought in her brother's Bible and set it on the mantel, then hung her apron on the peg near the door. That night, the four of them sat on the cabin floor while stew simmered over the fire. Elijah passed around bowls, and Susanna handed him a slice of dried apple she'd preserved earlier that summer. "Did I tell you I used to play the fiddle?" she asked, watching the flames. "No," Elijah said, leaning back against the wall. "My father taught me. I haven't touched one in years, but I still remember the way it felt under my chin. The strings always caught my sleeve. You miss it, some days. I think I could find one again if I looked hard enough." "I'll keep my eye out next time I ride into town," he said. She looked at him, thoughtful. "You ever want more than this?" He stirred the coals with a piece of kindling. "I don't need more, but I'd take whatever you want to build." Susanna set down her bowl. "Most men I knew back home would have said that different. Would have told me what I should want. I'm not most men." "No," she said. "You're not." Outside, the trees swayed, casting long shadows across the clearing. Eben had nodded off with his head on his arms, and Elsie lay curled against her blanket, thumb tucked beneath her chin. Susanna stood and crossed to the doorway. The night air was warm, but a breeze stirred the hem of her skirt. She looked out into the dark, then back at Elijah. "I've been thinking about teaching again," she said. "Not in a schoolhouse, just the children nearby. There's more than a few, and their folks are too far from town for lessons. We could clear part of the barn loft," he offered. "Use it mornings before chores." Her eyes lit with something he hadn't seen before, quiet purpose, edged with hope. "You'd be all right with that. I'd be proud of it," he said. She stepped toward him then, slow and certain, and reached for his hand. Her fingers threaded through his without hesitation. "I never thought I'd find a place that felt like mine," she said. "Now I have." Elijah didn't move. Just looked at her like he'd been waiting years to hear it. "You're not just staying through the rain," he said quietly. "You're staying through the seasons." She leaned her forehead against his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her back. "I'm staying for good," she whispered. And he believed her. The first frost came early that year. Elijah rose before dawn to frost lace on the window panes and a thin crust of ice over the water bucket near the door. He stoked the stove in the cabin's corner while Susanna wrapped Elsie in a quilt and set a pan of oats to warm. They spoke little in the mornings now, not from silence but from rhythm, the comfort of lives grown familiar. By full light, Eben had saddled the mule and walked it down to the creek's edge, where he hauled water for the day's wash. Susanna had gathered the last of the root vegetables 2 days before and set them in the dugout behind the cabin, packed in sawdust and burlap sacks Elijah had brought back from a trader's stop north of Deer Lodge. They'd meant to finish chinking the west side of the barn before snowfall, but had put it off when neighbors sent word that their eldest had taken sick. Susanna rode out with a satchel of dried willow bark and a jar of honey. She returned after dark with tired eyes and someone else's child asleep across her lap. The girl stayed 3 nights with them, until her fever broke. "You've a way of being needed," Elijah said once, as he watched her tuck the girl in beside Elsie. "I'd rather be useful," she replied, "than forgotten." When the girl returned home, Susanna stood long by the window after the wagon rolled out of sight, her arms folded tight and her mouth drawn. Elijah brought her tea and she took it without looking up. He didn't say anything more. He didn't need to. By November, the cabin was sealed tight, the barn patched and dry, and the loft cleared and swept. On Mondays and Thursdays, children from 3 homesteads rode in on ponies or sat bundled in the back of wagons, clutching slates and folded readers. Susanna greeted them by name and taught them letters and sums and songs from memory. Elijah built a rack for their coats and hung a lantern in the rafters for the shorter days. One evening, as the last of the children left and the light faded amber through the loft window, Elijah helped her stack stools and gather books. "You're building something," he said, watching her tuck a folded slate into her bag. "I used to think I needed a town to do it," she said. "Turns out I just needed a place to stay still." He reached for her hand, warm from the fire still burning below, and held it without fanfare. "I want to marry you," he said. She didn't answer right away. She looked down at their joined hands, then up at him again. "I thought I'd never hear that from someone who saw me as I am," she said. "I see you," she nodded once. Then yes. They married in December, beneath a sky the color of tin, with only the children and a neighbor couple to witness. Susanna wore a wool dress the shade of heather, and Elijah shaved his beard down to the jaw, just for the day. Eben stood beside him, taller now and proud in his boots. Elsie held a handful of dried sage from the ridge and looked up at Susanna like she was watching something sacred. Afterward, they shared biscuits and boiled coffee beside the hearth, and the wind tapped soft against the window panes. Elijah carved a band from a strip of silver he'd traded for in town, and slipped it onto her finger with hands that didn't tremble. That night, after the children were asleep and the fire burned low, Susanna sat beside him on the quilted bed, her knees drawn beneath her skirt. "I don't carry lace or fine things," she said, "but I know how to make a home." Elijah brushed a curl from her temple. "You already have." She leaned her head against his shoulder and he wrapped his arm around her waist, drawing her close. They said nothing more. The silence was full of warmth. Years later, when the school grew too large for the loft, Elijah raised a 1-room building near the creek, and Susanna taught there until the lines on her hands deepened and her hair silvered along the temples. Eben took to carpentry and built his own house down near the bend. Elsie married a rancher's son and brought her children back each week to hear stories in the old cabin. Sometimes, in the long evenings of late summer, Elijah and Susanna sat on the porch with their fingers intertwined, watching the sun dip behind the hills. They didn't speak of the years before, the hunger or the fear or the long roads behind them. They spoke of the garden or the calves, or which child had learned to read. And every now and then, when the cedar wind stirred the air just right, Susanna would hum a tune from long ago, and Elijah would close his eyes and listen, grateful always that she had stayed through the seasons.